Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Drupadi Chattopadhyay from the Department of English, S&DT Women's University. And today we are going to talk about gender and popular culture. We are going to talk about gender and popular culture both in the context of theoretical positions in the West as well as its implications and theoretical positions which have emerged in India, so as to position the theoretical understanding of popular culture in our cultural, social and political context. To begin with, let us look at some of the learning objectives. After having studied this module, the students would be able to 1. Problematize the notion of culture, process the contribution of culture studies in understanding culture across disciplines, analyze the relationship between culture and popular culture, critically estimate the role of gender in popular culture, with women not only as consumers but also producers, and then apply these theoretical positions to evaluate the gender roles in popular culture practices in India, thereby evaluating their own subject positions. To begin with, let us discuss what is culture. That is the first thing that we need to understand even before we begin talking about popular culture. So, to begin discussing the constituents of the term popular culture, we need to dwell briefly on the term culture first. Not only have the socio-political contexts of the emergence of the term culture affected the ways in which we comprehend the popular, but the ways and means of examining the term culture, or what we call the cultural turn, have had profound impact in the study of the popular. The term culture is a ubiquitous term and is deeply contested as a category at home, in the parlor, in the streets and in the academic spaces alike. In common parlance, culture is defined in opposition to its lack thereof. We often hear people being accused of not being cultured enough. As one would notice, such usage implies a sort of set social systems that more often than not comply with the interests of the dominant classes. Very often, the so-called people who lack culture are or were ones who were at the margins of the society. The connotations that this term carries have changed over a period of time. The Oxford reference, for example, defines it as, I quote, "the way of life of a people, including their attitudes, values, beliefs, arts, sciences, modes of perception, and habits of thought and activity." Cultural features or forms of life are learned but are often too pervasive to be readily noticed from within, unquote. From the definition, it seems that it is a loose association without a ready formal purpose. On careful examination, although, such as by the cultural materialists like Raymond Williams, it emerges that culture in fact is a very contested space and is often driven by the interest of the dominant classes. Given that these dominant classes and their interest might not be static, he suggests that there are almost always a dominant culture, an emerging culture and a residual culture. Most historians are likely to agree that these definitions of culture are tied to an understanding of class that emerged only after the Industrial Revolution. Matthew Arnold, in his book Culture and Anarchy, published in 1869, for instance, promoted the use of culture as a study of social perfection that could well serve as an antidote to unintelligent and uncultivated, and in this sense he positions culture against the possible onslaught of what he calls anarchy. He suggested that the contemporary Victorian English society could be divided into three classes: the barbarians, Philistines and the populace. The barbarians or the aristocracy are the privileged enough to have invested themselves in appreciating and maintaining the pursuit of a true sense of beauty. The Philistines or the middle classes, on the other hand, are only concerned about making money and are completely indifferent, or in some cases hostile to beauty. The last one in this hierarchy are the populace, who are very violent and in their prejudices, and only enjoy brutal pleasures. Studies in culture have moved away from such positions of understanding culture merely as a bourgeois outcome, but to analyze what Paul Duguay et al. Have called the circuit of culture, comprising what they call representation, identity, production, consumption and regulation. In this regard, Clifford Geertz's definition of culture, which is, I quote, an historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, become particularly significant. He imbues all cultural artifacts with embodied meanings, thereby considerably increasing the mandate of culture in reading into meaning-making processes. So now we are going to look at the relationship between culture and popular culture. As of now, we have dealt with the ramifications of understanding culture. Now we are going to look at how does this understanding of culture relate with our understanding of popular culture. So in the beginning of the 1960s, a cross-cultural discipline, primarily at the intersection of the literary criticism, sociology, history and anthropology, emerged called culture studies, which was increasingly based on the possibility of closely examining social, economic, political systems which produce varied forms of cultural phenomena. So, the meanings of these cultural phenomena would be studied to understand processes of production, access and reception of social meanings. For instance, analyzing what modes of cultural productions are legitimized by society, why do social practices consistently undermine certain cultural phenomena while privileging others. And popular culture, for one, has been historically read as the proverbial other, pitted against a more genteel culture. For most part, this emerged from an understanding of popular culture as some sort of residue, or as John Story would put it, at least oppositional and well outside the domain of culture per se, promoted by the dominant powers of the society. Studies in popular culture have sought to dismantle this hierarchized understanding of culture and instead look for interweaving threads of culture, power and politics. Roland Barthes, in his influential study, Mythologies, elaborates on how everyday cultural products, however inconsequential they might seem, like women's fashion, soap powders or professional wrestling, carry different orders of meaning. Their performance as cultural artifacts are societal means of generating what Barthes calls myths. For example, in the case of professional wrestling, meaning, often contested, is generated as a tacit understanding of a shared language between the audience and the wrestlers. Stuart Hall belonged to what is popularly called Birmingham School of Culture Studies and understood popular culture as one of the most important modes of social expression. And he, in particular, along with others like Hogarth, for example, studied popular culture as an opposition to only having studied high culture in academies. He is particularly interested in understanding issues of representation and ways and means which the dominant culture continues to co-opt other marginal voices. Simply put, he viewed popular culture as disruptive of the normative order and hence carried the potential of transgression and subversion. Historically speaking, Vinay Lal and Ashish Nandi would like to argue that critics in India took to popular culture studies only in the wake of the emergency. One of the reasons being that the Indian mass culture, often in the form of the kitsch, are what they call self-subversive. as the popular increasingly became the crucial battlegrounds where battles between old and new, the traditional and the modern, the global and the local were being fought through the renegotiation of myths and fantasy life. It also held the key to subverting the grandiloquence of the idioms of the state, the nation, the dominant ideology of rationality, and ultimately even sanity. So moving from this understanding of popular culture, one thing that emerges out of it is how popular culture or low culture was seen as a sort of threat to high culture. And one of the outcomes was the understanding of morality that the dominant classes so preserved. So now we are going to talk about the idea of morality and panic as is evidenced in the way that popular culture was understood. Popular culture has been routinely seen as forms of disruption that has the potential to suitably destabilize genteel forms of culture. For instance, popular culture was often associated with the notions of vulgar in the 19th century India, as has been evidenced by Sumanta Banerjee in his very influential study called The Parlour and the Streets, Elite and Popular Culture in 19th century Calcutta. Banerjee uses a popular culture to enter the world of the colonial modern babus. Banerjee's babus found on the streets were different from the babus that one was likely to encounter in the pages of high literature, for example, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Found in the low cultural forms like the Jatra troops and Kobigan, rhymes and ditties and Kalighat paintings, these babus were often objects of ridicule. Using humor, the ruling elite of colonial Bengal was often critiqued in the popular literary forms. Anindita Ghosh, in her book Power in Print, Popular Publishing and the Politics of Language and Culture in a Colonial Society, which was published in 2006, continues the conversation between the elite and popular cultures in colonial Bengal that Sumanta Banerjee had started. Abandoning the highbrow Bhadralok literature, Ghosh focuses on the rapid proliferation of cheap print known as Bottola literature to understand the Bengal Renaissance. Ghosh notes that debates and discussions found in the Bottola literature suggested that the elite's discourse in proper language meant that the vulgar came to be virtually associated with marginal groups like lower classes, castes, Muslims and women. However, these marginalized groups in turn leveraged Bottola literature to critique and often destabilize the absolute norms of morality, tastes and values set by the Bhadralok elite. Now we are going to look at moving away from understanding popular as an opposition to the elite. We are now going to look at one marginal group among several groups who are represented very often in the popular cultural domain. So we are going to talk about women in popular culture and talk about the gender question now in popular culture. Gender studies in popular culture has veered towards understanding an unconscious patriarchal setup which sets little attention otherwise. Since the 1960s, women critics have constantly pointed towards how popular cultural forms not only promote certain idealized gender roles but also move towards creating ways and means of reading or appreciating them, which are then inherently patriarchal. Researchers towards understanding the role of gender in popular culture have picked on both its production and consumption. Women were seen as the primary consumers of romance novels in the 20th century. Moving away from earlier approaches, feminist interventions studying the phenomena of women reading romance novels did not dismiss them as poor cousins of the respectable novel form. Although novels in the 19th century were seldom read as a serious literary enterprise and was assigned the role of women's pastime. In an article published in 1983 called Women Read the Romance, Janice Radway examines the readership of the Harlequin romances. She refrains from rejecting the romances based on their literary merit. She rather chooses to study the larger implications of having to read fantastic romantic encounters. She attributes the avid interest of women readers to the oppressive patriarchal system which was manifested in their mundane lives full of repetitive chores. This fantasy, as she explains, is, I quote, not a fantasy about discovering a uniquely interesting life partner, but a ritual wish to be cared for, loved and validated in a particular way. Rosalind Coward's Female Desire, published in 1984, uses psychoanalytical theory to understand the conundrum of rising popularity of romance alongside the increased visibility and growth of feminism. She suggests that the fantasies in the romance novels are essentially, and I quote, pre-adolescent, very nearly pre-conscious. And to quote her, romantic fiction is surely popular because it restores the childhood world of sexual relations and suppresses criticisms of inadequacy of men, the suffocation of the family, or the damage inflicted by patriarchal power. Yet it simultaneously manages to avoid the guilt and fear which might come from the childhood world. Sexuality is defined firmly as the father's responsibility, and fear of suffocation is overcome because women achieve a sort of power in romantic fiction. Romantic fiction promises a secure world, promises that there will be safety with dependence, that there will be power with subordination, unquote. Laura Mulvey, moving away from romances, now is looking towards film studies and talking about women as consumers of film. What happens and what are these gender roles which are assigned to women when we watch films? Laura Mulvey, in the article, in a very famous article called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, very effectively uses psychoanalytical criticism to read cinematic images. Following the footsteps of John Berger in The Ways of Seeing, she firmly agrees that there can never be an unfiltered and unconscious way of seeing. So, seeing, or the act of seeing, is a very conscious act. Seeing is rather a very complex phenomena, as the production and consumption are both often dictated by patriarchy. To quote, "The gender power asymmetry is a controlling force in cinema and constructed for the pleasure of the male viewer, which is deeply rooted in patriarchal ideologies and discourses," unquote. She says the women represented in these visual media in accordance to the male desire, which she calls the male gaze. Hence, women are reduced to being the bearer of meaning rather than the maker of meaning. So many of us may have grown up with hearing popular Bollywood songs. We have admired beautiful heroines, maybe attempted dressing up and speaking like them. Until the late 2000s, however, excepting the parallel cinema movement in India, there were very few opportunities for thinking women with agency in these Bollywood representations of them. Sohini Chattopadhyay notes that women as warriors or as departures from the normative roles assigned to them have only gained attention in the past few years. Apart from the popular stunt genre of the 1930s and the 40s, women as agents have largely remained as an anomaly rather than the norm. Given that these roles were written, directed and produced by men, and often about women who were far removed from everyday realities, one could also question whether they were themselves a manifestation of a certain kind of male fantasy. Women in action hero films routinely appeared to be arm candies worthy of distractions. The musical genre also often promoted meek women waiting for their male guardians to rescue them from potential danger. Catherine Hansen, for example, noted in an essay published in the Economic and Political Weekly in 1988 that women were seen only in largely two female gender roles, that of a devoted wife or a powerful mother. In contrast, the role of the noted that Virangana, derived from folk forms such as tamasha and nautanki, stands as an, I quote, alternative paradigm challenging the self roles for women. Ipshita Chando argues in her book Packaging Freedom, Feminism and Popular Culture that contrary to what academics might perceive, TV soap operas like the K series by Ekta Kapoor or magazines like Shanunda published in Bangla, Femina or Meri Saheli have in effect brought some of the major debates of the women's movement into our living rooms. She further suggests that these representations, and I quote, can be used for the purpose of rejecting the popular idea of feminism as man-bashing or bra-burning and replacing it with the notion of movement as a strategy for coping with based on a certain vision of changed reality. Another such departure is the item girl in Bollywood. Considered as overtly sexualized, these women were rarely associated with the desirable women in Bollywood. Sanjay Srivastava, for example, has wonderfully demonstrated how these gender identities were carefully stabilized in Bollywood with respect to the cultural politics of Indian masculinity. It was processed through, and I quote, specific elements of Indian modernity, a nationalist discourse in which woman as a sign has fluctuated between the poles of the mother and the sexually dangerous being. He concludes that through traditional, provincial, masculine politics or modern metropolitan nationalist discourse, the sign of the woman continued to be inscribed through masculinist ideologies. One can very easily read these item numbers therefore as objectification of women. However, as recent studies have shown, we can also read these images as women taking active part in demonstrating their sexuality, thereby undermining the possibility of only the male gaze determining the meaning-making process of these images. Item numbers therefore participate in a complex visual domain. A song, for example, like Sheila Ki Jawani, can be used to read this complexity and perhaps suggest how this song is possibly a commentary of other preceding songs in this genre. The eponymous character of the song is no item girl per se, but a leading Bollywood actress, Katrina Kaif. Unlike other Bollywood item songs where women are objects of desire, Sheila openly owns her sexuality and also proclaims control over her body. She says, "I am too sexy for you, tere haath na aani." So from our discussion on certain aspects of popular culture studies, we can safely assume that popular cannot be easily dismissed as lying outside the domain of meaning-making processes of the elite or dominant culture. The examples taken have demonstrated how popular culture has been instrumental in challenging gender hierarchies, and more often than not, women have been barred from participating in the production, dissemination and regulation of gender roles of the dominant culture. The disruptive and transgressive potential of popular culture have been continuously used by women to articulate and often enter contested spaces which are otherwise denied to them. Thank you very much for watching this particular episode and being with us.